forced stealth section, a staple of action-adventure games for quite some time, tends to evoke eye rolls and exasperated sighs because of its poor implementation. This poor implementation often arises from the sudden and unwelcome breaking of momentum in action games. The addition of occasionally ridiculous checkpoint systems and strict fail states only compound the problem. Action games have had a basic set of ground rules for most of their existence, a huge part of which is the feeling of power and fearlessness a game about violence can bring. The severe and immediate retractment of power from the player can bring humbling tension, but more often than not, they add more instability to the suspension of your disbelief. A recent release that saw a half-baked stealth section is Hotline Miami. After a few hours of non-stop psychedelic violence, the game suddenly asks you to sneak out of a hospital. It's a mess of horrible sightlines and terrible player direction, whose problems are only compounded by the addition of trippy on-screen effects that disorient and can bring about an unfair failure. It's a good example of why these missions can be so reviled. They completely betray a game's established rules, but not in an exciting and fresh manner, but one that derails the flow of a game. If an action game expects to find success in this section, their basic gameplay mechanics must translate well from action to stealth, or they must devote time into fleshing out new systems to accommodate such a sudden change. Two examples of achieving this success can be found in the Call of Duty series. First found in Modern Warfare with All Gillied Up. The player is sent into a flashback and asked to sneak through a myriad of heavily armed soldiers. It's surprising, not only in the sudden tonal shift, but also in how well Call of Duty's mechanics translate. It's a slow-burning mission, whose quiet nature is matched by its dreary art direction. The intensity is only strengthened by the wonderful use of music, which wouldn't be out of place in a horror movie with spacey strings, shifting into marching horns at crazy moments. It's heavily scripted, but wildly entertaining. From what I've seen, it's considered to be one of the best missions in the entire franchise. But when it comes to stealth in a Call of Duty game, I think the most recent release, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, may have usurped the throne with Sentinel. With the exosuit, the game's futuristic cyborg body armor, the developers of Advanced Warfare clearly saw a great excuse to experiment with the often ham-fisted variety found in recent Call of Duties. In Sentinel, you must infiltrate a massive estate, and the exosuit gives you the ability to tag people, grapple onto ledges, and silently execute guards. The player is given multiple routes to each of their clearly defined destinations, and the modern architecture of the estate is perfect for player guidance without seeming overly artificial. They also both have lenient and well-defined means of failure, which is incredibly important. Call of Duty's fluid gameplay systems may not convert well to on-rails flight or dog controlling, but they make for some excellent covert missions. Variety can be dangerous though, and most open world games are built around it, with sometimes an outrageous amount of different gameplay styles on offer, which can make for some infuriatingly shallow stealth. At times it can be optional, like in Crysis when you have options on how to approach certain challenges, but others have missions which force you into stealth roles, which usually fall into two varieties: sneaking and stalking. The first being a traditional sneaking mission, often asking for the use of silent weapons or knives, the latter being tailing missions. Grand Theft Auto has both of these types. Examples can be found in pretty much all of them, but San Andreas' attempts at true stealth were pretty interesting. They were simplistic, with one-button executions to bring down enemies, and obvious shadow areas to hide in. But I'm glad they took the time to make these missions, and to make them playable, even if they are completely unnecessary in the long run. It's decent fun to sneak up on people and stab them in the throat. In a game series about throwing things at the wall, it was the last piece I actually expected to stick. The most recent Grand Theft Auto added a bit more heft behind its stealth sections, with the player having to do set tasks when setting up for heists, but these are rendered basically unfailable because of how heavily they restrict the player, almost boiling down to slightly guided cutscenes, unless you actively try to piss the game off. This keeps the gameplay variety at a maximum and frustration at a minimum, but it destroys replayability, something that Grand Theft Auto V's missions generally suffered from. More frequent than this traditional stealth approaches are tailing missions or stalking missions, which I almost never enjoy. A game that made a conscious effort to make tailing someone a bit more enjoyable was Mafia II, which introduced a speed limiter to keep the player's car going about the same speed as who they were following, instead of having to suffer through the stop-and-go routine routine found in most other games. I wish it was commonplace now, but it isn't. Mafia II did a lot of things right. I really hope that game isn't forgotten. Another factor that's needed for stealth mission success is creating systems that allow for good player awareness, something that can be made even more difficult by the narrowed perspective found in first-person shooters. Two games came out around the same time in 2002 and 2003 that faced this problem head-on in very different methods. The visually stimulating and cleverly sequenced shooter 13, often stylized as XIII, saw a few appearances of forced stealth, which when played today are lengthy and mechanically unpolished. 13 tried to keep the player notified of enemy positions with on-screen pop-ups and visually represented footstep sounds. It worked to a point, but in the end the gameplay and visual design of the game didn't lend itself well to stealth. It felt inaccurate, unfair, and far too quick to call for failure. The year before saw a game to attack the problem from a different direction. TimeSplitters 2, a game not unlike Call of Duty in its focus on speed and smoothness, gave the player a handheld machine that had a number of different functions. But when the game asked you to tail someone and sneak into a secret hideout, it was used to keep an eye on camera sightlines and NPC movements. The machine is a wonderful response to this problem, especially when you consider the trade-off between having a weapon or knowing the position of your enemies. It's a clever balance choice. The section feels great, the difficulty is high, and it's the perfect length, even if getting caught is still a bit too quick. Third-person action games have to worry a lot less about player awareness, with their massively increased viewing angles, but they can fail just as often. The Order 1886, a recent big-budget release, saw the need for a few moments of forced stealth. They play out a bit like cutscenes, with kills being done in a quick-time event and far too few enemies to bring about any real tension. What could have been, at best, forgettable is made pretty bad because of how little control is given to the player. The Uncharted series, another game that favors visual fidelity over most everything else, has a number of sequences that call for playing quiet, not many actually requiring it though. The garden section in Uncharted 2 has fail states for being caught, but it's heavily guided and a nice introduction to the game. It helps that Nathan's sneak attacks are done in such a way that the player can almost feel like they're cheesing the game, which in and of itself can be kind of empowering in a weird way. Both of these games had a pretty hard time finding a satisfying balance of difficulty in their stealth though. A staple in gaming's history, The Legend of Zelda is a common offender that does find a nice balance in difficulty. They often offer an obvious route to complete your objective, which is the easiest and quickest as well, but they place little incentives in dangerous places to give optional difficulty to those who wish to seek it. Zelda's forced stealth satisfies more than infuriates because of this. Ocarina of Time made stealth a slide past a number of guards in Hyrule Castle. It's easy and quick enough to not tire the player, and ever since its appearance, it's shown up in pretty much all of Link's adventures. I really don't consider any of these moments in the series to be complete missteps. Zelda games are often hallmarks of quality in gaming, and even at their worst, they're still quite good. But probably the most memorable stealth moment in The Legend of Zelda appears a bit later in the series, with a relatively lengthy bit of barrel sneaking in GameCube's Wind Waker. It's an incredibly divisive moment, with an exploitable fail state that allows you to bypass parts of the level. I consider it mostly successful though, because it adds often unseen tension to the game, and forces the player to not rely on their weaponry. It also offers consistently clear portrayals of what will bring about failure, with large spotlights and vision circles from guards' lamps. I always have the best time when conditions that bring about a fail state are clearly defined, and this is also why I remember Zelda's stealth moments fondly, with their cones of vision having often obvious depictions and so on, leading the gameplay to be more akin to a puzzle than espionage. In the end, I have the most fun when sneaking in a non-stealth game when they do play out like puzzles. TimeSplitters 2's stealth is mostly spent staring at a tiny in-game screen and making a dot avoid big moving cones. Call of Duty's Sentinel mission is basically a big string of timing-based movements, and Zelda's were worth mentioning because they know that these are at their most fun when they are approached this way. Simple but challenging, tense but not irritating. The forced stealth section when done well can be easy to miss, but I hope it's never forgotten. Thank you so much for watching.